Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The child arrived in autumn, carried in the arms of a lay brother whose name the boy would never learn. No one explained where he came from or why. Perhaps his mother had died. Perhaps she could not afford to keep him. The monastery asked no questions, and children learned early not to ask them either. He was given a name, Thomas, and a place in the dormitory among a dozen other orphans and foundlings whose origins were equally obscure. The Benedictine monastery sat in a fold of Burgundian hills, its stone walls the color of old honey, its bell tower visible for leagues across the autumn fields. The monks moved through their days like water through channels worn smooth by centuries, matins in darkness, lauds as the sun cracked the horizon, then work and prayer and more work, the hours marked by bells that seemed to come from heaven itself. Thomas learned quickly that the monastery was a place of patterns, and patterns, once learned, made life simple. You rose when the bell rang. You prayed when told to pray. You ate what was given. You asked nothing and received what was deemed necessary. But even in a place built on obedience, a child finds cracks to slip through. The monastery garden lay on the south side of the cloister, sheltered by a stone wall where the sun gathered in the afternoons like something that wanted to stay. Here, between the rows of herbs and the twisted apple trees, Thomas discovered something the rhythm of the offices could not provide: solitude that felt like freedom. An elderly monk named Brother Cuthbert tended the garden with a devotion that bordered on prayer. He did not speak much, but he did not mind the presence of the boy, and gradually, as seasons turned, Thomas became his shadow. Brother Cuthbert showed him which plants healed and which poisoned, how to read the seasons and the movement of insects, how to listen to the particular silence of growing things. More importantly, he showed him that work could be a form of meditation, that the hands could speak when the mouth must stay silent. In the garden, Thomas felt less like an orphan and more like someone tending something that mattered. It was in the garden, too, that he first encountered music, though he did not recognize it as such at first. Brother Cuthbert hummed while he worked, old fragments of chants and secular songs, melodies that seemed to rise from his chest without intention. The first time Thomas heard him, he stopped and listened. The melody was not like the austere plain chant of the offices. It had curves and variations, a sweetness that seemed almost sinful. When Brother Cuthbert noticed him listening, the old monk smiled, a rare expression on a face worn smooth by decades of silence, and continued humming, louder and more deliberately, as if sharing a secret. Within a year, Thomas was humming too. Within two, the cantor of the monastery, a sharp-eyed man named Brother Anselm, noticed him in the chapel and summoned him. The boy was terrified. Summonings meant correction, but Brother Anselm merely listened to him sing a simple chant and nodded. "You have an ear," the cantor said. It was not praise exactly, but it was acknowledgment. "Come to the scriptorium after none. We will see if you have anything else." Thomas had something else. He had a hunger for music that surprised even him, a need that emerged as he grew, like a thirst appearing suddenly in the middle of a drought. Music was not like the prayers, which he performed because obedience demanded it. Music was like the garden. It was something that lived, that changed, that seemed to contain more than just sound. In the scriptorium, Brother Anselm taught him the basics of notation, the relationships between notes, the ancient theory that governed melody. More practically, he gave him access to a battered lute that had belonged to a traveling musician who had died at the monastery decades earlier, and whose instrument had been preserved for reasons no one quite remembered. The lute was miraculous. Thomas practiced in secret, in the corners of the dormitory after the night office, fingers learning slowly to find the strings, to coax them into something resembling music. The other boys mocked him, calling him the cantor's pet. But their mockery was lazy. He was still an orphan like them, still subject to the same hierarchies and humiliations. His music did not elevate him. If anything, it marked him as strange, as someone not quite settled into the monastery's rhythms. Yet the abbot noticed. The abbot Oswald was a man of perhaps 70, with the bearing of someone who had once held secular authority before his vocation claimed him. He heard Thomas singing in the chapel one morning, a soloist on a feast day, his young voice untrained but genuine, and afterwards summoned him to the abbot's private chamber, a place most monks entered only once or twice in their lives. The chamber was spare, a narrow bed, a desk scattered with papers and wax tablets, a crucifix, nothing more. Abbot Oswald sat behind his desk and studied Thomas with an expression the boy could not read. "You sing well," the abbot said. "Brother Anselm tells me you learn quickly." "Yes, Father Abbot." Thomas kept his eyes on the stone floor. "Do you wish to remain here, to take vows when you are old enough?" The question hung in the air like a bell that had just struck. Thomas felt something in his chest shift, a recognition that he was being asked something real, that his answer might matter. He thought of Brother Cuthbert in the garden, of Brother Anselm in the scriptorium, of the bell tower and the chants and the pattern of days that had become familiar. But he thought also of the traveling musician, whose lute now belonged to him, of the stories that pilgrims sometimes brought to the monastery, tales of roads and towns, of performances and coins earned, of a world beyond the walls. "I do not know, Father Abbot," he said finally, and it was the truest thing he had ever said. Abbot Oswald made a small sound that might have been laughter or approval. "Honest, at least. Well, music is a gift, Thomas. In here, it serves God and order. Out there," he gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the world beyond the walls, "music serves something else. It serves life. Whether that is better or worse, I cannot say, but I suspect you will find out for yourself." The abbot's words unsettled him more than any correction could have. They suggested possibilities, futures that extended beyond the monastery's stone walls. Over the next several years, as Thomas grew from child to young man, that conversation returned to him again and again. He continued to study music, to tend the garden with Brother Cuthbert when he could, to help in the scriptorium. He learned Latin, not perfectly, but enough to understand the liturgy, to read simple texts. He discovered that his memory was exceptional. He could listen to a story once and retain its details, recall its rhythms and phrases. This, too, marked him as unusual, but it also made him useful. When abbots from other monasteries visited, Thomas was sometimes called upon to recite for them, a demonstration of the quality of education the monastery could provide. When important pilgrims arrived at the hospice, he was asked to entertain them with songs and stories during the evening meal. He discovered that he possessed not just the ability to sing, but the ability to make people listen, to hold their attention through the modulation of his voice, the choice of which story to tell, the pacing of jokes and more serious moments. It was in these performances, small, confined to the monastery and its guests, that he first understood that music and storytelling were not just expressions of faith or skill. They were a kind of power. Not the crude power of authority, but something subtler, the power to make people feel, to transform their understanding of the evening or the day, to give shape and meaning to moments that might otherwise be forgotten. By the time Thomas reached his 17th year, it was clear to everyone, including himself, that he did not belong in the monastery. Not because he was unsuitable, he was obedient, skilled, pious enough, but because something in him remained restless. Abbot Oswald summoned him again, older now, his face more deeply lined. "You will leave us," the abbot said. It was not a question. "Yes, Father Abbot, I believe I must." "Brother Cuthbert is dying," the abbot continued. "He has perhaps a month. He wishes to see you before he goes." Thomas visited the old monk in the infirmary, where Brother Cuthbert lay in a narrow bed, his hands folded on the blanket, his breathing shallow. The old man's eyes were still bright, though, and when he saw Thomas, he smiled. "You are leaving," Cuthbert said. It was not surprising that he knew. "Yes, brother." "Good. The garden is a good teacher, but it cannot teach you everything. You must go out into the world. You must see what grows there." The old monk paused, gathering breath. "I will tell you a secret. When I was young, before I came here, I traveled. I was a performer, like you will be. Not as skilled as you will become, but I had the gift. I came here because I was afraid. I came here because it was safe. I do not regret it. The garden has been my work, and work is a blessing. But I regret the fear. Do not be afraid, Thomas. The world will hurt you, but music will help you survive." 2 weeks later, Brother Cuthbert died quietly in his sleep. Thomas attended the funeral mass, sang the requiem, and felt something settle inside him like sediment in water. The question had been answered. The abbot provided him with a traveling cloak, a small purse of coins, enough for a month's travel perhaps, and a letter of recommendation to the bishop's household in Troia, written in the abbot's careful script. On a morning in late autumn, when the leaves had turned the color of old blood and the wind carried the smell of rain, Thomas walked through the monastery gates for the last time. He did not look back. Behind him lay 17 years of routine and safety, of learning and small kindnesses. Ahead lay the world, roads he had never traveled, towns he had never seen, and a future that seemed vast and terrifying and impossibly full of possibility. The lute was slung across his back, wrapped carefully in cloth. In his pocket was the letter from the abbot. In his chest was a mixture of joy and fear so intense it felt almost like pain. He was 18 years old, skilled in music, but untested in the world. He possessed no family, no name of consequence, no connections beyond a letter and a reputation for talent that meant nothing outside the monastery walls. He walked east toward Troy, and the monastery bell tolled the offices behind him, growing fainter with each mile. The sound persisted in his mind long after it became inaudible, a kind of ghost bell, reminding him of what he had been, hinting at what he might become. The roads stretched before him, and Thomas, who had never had a choice about anything in his life, stepped onto them with a combination of faith and recklessness that would, in the years to come, define everything that followed. The first night on the road, Thomas slept in a ditch beside a wheat field, wrapped in his cloak with the lute held against his chest like a child. He woke to the sound of a cart passing, the driver cursing at oxen, and the realization that he was cold, hungry, and utterly alone in a way the monastery had never permitted. The fear that had seemed manageable in daylight became something physical in the darkness, a tightness in his throat, a quickness in his breathing. He rose and walked until the sun came up, using motion to convince himself that he had chosen this, that he was not simply fleeing. By the third day, the letter of introduction had proven its worth. A merchant traveling to Troy allowed Thomas to ride in his cart in exchange for songs in the evenings. The merchant was a thin man with the harried expression of someone perpetually calculating profit and loss. But he was not unkind. He provided bread and cheese, and when Thomas played the lute, he listened without interrupting, which was perhaps the greatest courtesy a patron could offer. The road to Troy was not dramatic. No bandits, no storms, no incidents that would later merit retelling. Instead, it was the accumulation of small discomforts, the ache in his feet from walking, the soreness of his fingers from the lute strings, the way hunger made time move differently, stretching an afternoon into something that felt like days. He passed through villages where the houses were built of wood and thatch, where pigs rooted in the streets, and children watched him with the wary curiosity of creatures unused to strangers. He saw the first signs of winter in the turning of leaves and the hurried harvesting of fields. He began to understand that the world beyond the monastery was not more free exactly, but differently constrained, bound not by bells and obedience, but by hunger and necessity, and the arbitrary kindness or cruelty of those with coin. Troy itself was overwhelming. A walled city with perhaps 10,000 souls, it seemed impossibly vast and crowded after the quiet of the monastery. The bishop's household occupied a stone building near the cathedral, and Thomas presented his letter with a trembling hand. The master of the household, an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing lesser people, read it with visible skepticism. A young musician from a monastery was not exactly a prize, but the letter carried the abbot's seal, and the household was preparing for Christmas celebrations. Thomas was given a position, not a permanent one, but temporary, for the season, with payment of a few deniers per week and permission to sleep in the servants' quarters. It was in the bishop's household that Thomas learned the true currency of the road: information. The servants and minor clergy who populated the household gossiped relentlessly, and they told him things, stories that circulated through the city like water finding cracks in stone. The bishop had favored a young clerk who had subsequently been accused of theft. A merchant's daughter had run away with a soldier. The city guard had arrested a woman for witchcraft, though the accusations were clearly false, driven by a dispute over property. Thomas listened and remembered, and he began to understand that the world contained layers of truth that the monastery had never revealed. Not wickedness exactly, but complexity, contradiction, the way people's desires often conflicted with their circumstances and their stated values. By Christmas, he had saved enough coin to survive for a month beyond the season. He had also acquired something more valuable: a reputation as a performer who could make people forget their troubles for an evening. The bishop's household engaged him to perform at the Christmas feast. He sang carols and secular songs, told stories that made the assembled clergy and nobility laugh, and when it was finished, several of the younger nobles approached him with offers of patronage: a few coins to perform at private gatherings, an invitation to travel with a merchant to Amiens if he wished. Thomas chose the merchant. His name was Etienne, a dealer in wool with a sharp eye for profit and an equally sharp sense of humor. Etienne was perhaps 40, a widower with no children, and he seemed to view the young musician as both a curiosity and a genuine companion. They traveled to Amiens in early spring, moving slowly through roads that had become treacherous with mud. The journey took nearly 3 weeks, and in that time, Thomas learned the rhythms of the traveling life. He learned that merchants were endlessly calculating every mile, every meal, the price of lodging and fodder for horses, all converted into profit and loss. He learned that the roads were inhabited by a strange ecology of humanity: other merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, beggars, and performers like himself, all moving through a landscape that seemed infinite and repetitive in equal measure. He learned that a performer's value fluctuated based on circumstance and season, that the same song could be received with laughter one night and indifference the next, and that a portion of his income depended on the generosity of strangers, which meant his income was never certain. But he also learned something else. The roads contained stories that no monastery could provide. In the evenings, when he performed at inns or for Etienne's business contacts, he heard fragments of lives: a merchant's daughter lost to plague, a soldier's recounting of a crusade in the Holy Land, a beggar's cryptic warning about traveling too close to the borders of Anjou, where brigands operated. He began to collect these stories, to weave them into his performances, to develop a reputation not just as a musician, but as a source of news and entertainment. By his 22nd year, Thomas had traveled to perhaps a dozen towns, performed for minor nobility and wealthy merchants, and learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies that governed patronage. He was careful. The monastery had taught him caution, and this caution served him well. He did not drink heavily at inns, did not gamble, did not become entangled in the affairs of the towns he passed through. He was pleasant but distant, offering companionship without creating obligations, performing brilliantly but never so brilliantly as to threaten the status of those who employed him. It was in this careful cultivation of distance that he first encountered Reynaud. They met in Amiens, at an inn where Thomas was performing for a gathering of merchants. Reynaud was perhaps 5 years older, a performer of considerable skill, with a wit that was sharper and more dangerous than Thomas's own. Where Thomas charmed people into forgetting their troubles, Reynaud made them laugh at truths they usually avoided. He was lanky and restless, with the appearance of someone who had never quite settled into any role. After Thomas's performance, Reynaud approached him with an offer. They should travel together, pool their earnings, and move south toward the Loire Valley, where there was work and money to be made. Thomas, who had been traveling alone with merchants or as a hired performer, was drawn by the prospect of companionship. He accepted. For nearly 2 years they traveled together. They were successful by the standards of wandering performers. They ate regularly, saved coin, were welcomed at noble households and the better inns. Reynaud taught Thomas tricks of the trade, how to read an audience before performing, how to adjust a story based on who was listening, how to extract more coin through subtle implications of deeper knowledge than you actually possessed. Reynaud was cynical in ways that Thomas, despite his growing understanding of the world's complexity, had not yet become. He viewed patronage as a game to be played rather than a relationship to be cultivated, and he treated noble patrons with a mixture of flattery and barely concealed contempt that somehow increased rather than decreased their interest in him. But Reynaud also possessed a dangerous looseness. He would drink more than was wise, make jokes that came close to insulting his patrons, pursue women with an indifference to consequences that terrified Thomas. Where Thomas's caution was rooted in the monastery's teachings about humility, Reynaud's recklessness came from a conviction that nothing mattered much, and that those with power would forgive anything if you were sufficiently entertaining. The partnership ended in Orléans, at the household of a minor nobleman named Guillaume. Reynaud had become involved with a young woman in the household. Nothing serious, he claimed, just a pleasant distraction during their stay. But the woman was a relative of Guillaume's, and Guillaume, it turned out, had plans for her that did not include a wandering performer. The situation resolved without violence, but barely. They were paid their remaining earnings and asked to leave. Thomas was relieved. Reynaud seemed to consider it a mark of honor, further evidence of his appeal and daring. They parted ways in Tours. Reynaud spoke of traveling south toward Provence, seeking better prospects in warmer regions. Thomas decided to remain in the north and west, moving through Normandy and Brittany, the coasts and river valleys, where he had heard there was consistent work. They parted on good terms, with Reynaud extracting a promise that if their paths crossed again, they would reunite and travel together once more. Thomas kept the promise in his heart, though he also recognized it as the kind of thing people said when parting, with little intention of following through. Yet Reynaud, he sensed, would interpret the promise literally, would assume that Thomas meant it absolutely, and would eventually return to claim it. By his 25th year, Thomas had developed a reputation that extended across a considerable portion of northern France. He was known as a performer of considerable skill, a musician who could entertain nobles and commoners alike, a man of discretion, who did not speak carelessly about what he heard in households. His appearance had matured into something that people recognized, not handsome exactly, but distinctive, marked by the calloused fingers of a musician and the weathered skin of someone who spent significant time on roads. He possessed a quality that merchants and nobles seemed to value. He was present, but not intrusive, entertaining but not demanding, good at his work without seeming to take himself too seriously. He had saved enough coin to live modestly for several months without work, though he never allowed himself the luxury of extended idleness. The monastery had taught him that work was both practical necessity and spiritual good, and the road had reinforced this lesson. A performer without bookings was a performer losing reputation. He maintained a careful circuit, several noble households where he was regularly employed, markets and fairs where he could perform for the common people and earn supplementary coin, inns where he was recognized and welcome. It was also around this time that Thomas first encountered the peculiar loneliness that seemed to accompany success in his profession. He was welcomed into the households of nobles, treated with courtesy and often genuine warmth by those who employed him. And yet he was always fundamentally an outsider. He was not a servant. His status was higher based on his skills and talents. But he was not a companion or equal either. He occupied a liminal space, belonging fully to neither the world of nobility nor the world of ordinary people. The monastery had been a world with clear hierarchies, but also clear belonging. The road offered freedom, but freedom uncoupled from community. It was in response to this loneliness that he became too trusting of a fellow performer named Lucien. They met in Amiens in the spring of his 25th year, and Lucien seemed to offer the possibility of genuine friendship. Unlike Renaud, who viewed other performers as competition, Lucien expressed admiration for Thomas's work and suggested they collaborate, performing together, sharing bookings, pooling resources. For several months, this arrangement seemed to work. They traveled together, performed as a pair, and Thomas found himself enjoying the companionship. Then, in a small town near Rouen, while Thomas slept in their shared room at an inn, Lucien took the bulk of their accumulated savings and disappeared. It was a calculated theft. Lucien left enough coin that Thomas could return to Troya and recoup his losses through his patron network, but took enough to constitute a substantial loss. The betrayal was less about the money than about the revelation of his own misjudgment. Thomas had allowed himself to believe in Lucien's sincerity, had lowered his guard, and had been punished for it. He returned to Troy, where he was known and valued, and he did not make that mistake again. He maintained professional friendships with other performers, but no genuine partnerships. He was pleasant, but consistently maintained a kind of distance. This caution became characteristic of his approach to all relationships. He gave much in his performances, held something back in his personal life, and structured his relationships around exchanges that were clear and bounded rather than open and vulnerable. Yet beneath this careful performance of detachment, something else was happening. Thomas had begun to develop what might be called a philosophy, though he would never have used such a grand term. He had come to understand that the world operated on principles of exchange and power that were often invisible but always present. Those with wealth and status maintained their positions through networks of obligation and reciprocal favor. Those without such advantages, performers, servants, common people, survived by being useful, by making themselves valuable to those with power, and by understanding the unspoken rules that governed interaction across the divisions of class and status. He had also come to understand his own particular gift, which was not just musical skill but something more subtle: the ability to make people feel seen and understood, to use stories and songs to give shape to their own unexpressed feelings. This was a valuable gift, and it was also a dangerous one, because it could be mistaken for genuine connection when it was actually a highly skilled performance. Thomas knew the difference, even if his patrons sometimes did not. This knowledge was isolating, but it was also what allowed him to survive and eventually to thrive. By his mid-20s, Thomas had achieved a kind of stability that few wandering performers could claim. He had regular work in several households, was welcome at multiple markets and fairs, and had accumulated enough savings that he could afford modest lodgings in Troy during the winter months, when traveling was difficult. He had also developed a particular kind of reputation. He was the performer who remembered things, who could recount events from the region with surprising accuracy, who seemed to understand the unspoken currents of power and politics that moved through noble households and merchant gatherings. This reputation for observation would eventually prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. But in these years of his mid-20s, it was simply another aspect of his value to those who employed him. One more way in which a careful, cautious performer could make himself indispensable to the powerful people whose patronage he depended upon. The invitation arrived in late autumn, carried by a messenger on horseback who bore the seal of Lord Ashford, a nobleman whose holdings lay some distance to the east, in the borderlands between Champagne and Burgundy. Thomas had heard the name before, mentioned in passing by merchants and minor nobility, always with a kind of careful neutrality that suggested Ashford was a man of sufficient power to warrant respect, but not quite enough to inspire the deference given to the truly great. The message was brief and formal. Lord Ashford was hosting a gathering to celebrate the betrothal of his ward to a young lord of considerable standing. Musicians and performers would be welcome. Compensation would be generous. Thomas accepted immediately. A betrothal feast at a noble household meant 3 or 4 days of steady work, multiple performances, and access to patrons who might provide future commissions. It also meant an opportunity to observe the intricate dance of noble politics at close range, the marriages and alliances that shape the territories and power structures of the region. He had learned to value such observations, to file away details and relationships for later reference, though he could not have articulated why these details seemed important beyond a vague sense that understanding the world's hidden structures was its own form of wealth. The journey to Ashford's manor took 2 days of travel through territory that grew progressively less cultivated as he moved inland. The roads were adequate but not excellent, suggesting that while Ashford was wealthy, he was not wealthy enough to command the kind of resources necessary for significant infrastructure. The manor itself, when it appeared, was respectable but not grand, a stone building, perhaps a century old, surrounded by fortifications that were practical rather than ornamental. The lands around it showed signs of careful management. Fields recently harvested, orchards well tended, the kind of prosperity that came from competent administration rather than exceptional advantage. Lord Ashford received the performers in his hall on the afternoon of arrival. He was a man in his 50s, Thomas judged, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the face of someone who had learned to use authority without appearing to enjoy it. His hair had gone silver, and he wore it long, in the fashion of an earlier generation. His clothing was fine, but not ostentatious, good wool, dyed in a deep blue, silver clasps, a ring that suggested wealth without proclaiming it. When he spoke, His voice carried the particular timbre of someone who rarely needed to raise it to be heard. "You are the musician from Troy," Ashford said. It was not a question. "Brother Etienne, the merchant, has spoken of you highly. He says you have discretion as well as skill." "I am Thomas, Lord," he replied, bowing slightly. "I endeavor to provide entertainment that suits the occasion, without drawing undue attention to myself." Ashford smiled, a gesture that did not quite reach his eyes. "Precisely what one requires. The betrothal feast is tomorrow evening. There will be perhaps 60 guests. Nobility primarily, some merchants, clergy from the cathedral. The betrothal is between my ward, the Lady Marguerite, and the Lord Guillaume, son of the Count of Vertus. It is a good match, politically advantageous for both families. There will be tensions beneath the surface, as there always are at such gatherings. I require entertainment that maintains civility, without provoking reflection on those tensions. Do you understand?" "Yes, Lord." "Good. You will be compensated well. I will provide you with lodgings near the kitchen, not the servants' quarters, but not the guest chambers either. You will take your meals when the household takes its meals. You are welcome to move freely through the public spaces of the manor. You may observe, but you are not to comment on what you observe. Is this clear?" "Entirely clear, Lord." Ashford nodded and dismissed him with a gesture. As Thomas turned to leave, he noted the careful precision of the instructions. Ashford was a man who left nothing to chance, who understood the importance of controlling information and appearances. This made him either an excellent patron or a dangerous one. Perhaps both. The feast itself began at dusk the following evening, when servants had lit perhaps 100 candles throughout the great hall, transforming it into something golden and baroque. Long tables had been arranged in a rough rectangle, with Ashford seated at the head and the betrothed couple given places of honor. Thomas, observing from the margins before his performance, noted the composition carefully. The Lady Marguerite was perhaps 16, slender and fair-haired, with the kind of beauty that came from good birth and careful maintenance. She wore a dress of pale silk that must have cost a considerable sum, and jewels at her throat and wrists. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed into something that resembled pleasure, without quite achieving it. The Lord Guillaume sat beside her. He was younger than Thomas would have expected, perhaps 20, with the kind of handsomeness that came from lineage and privilege, rather than from any particular distinction of feature. But there was something in his expression that troubled Thomas, though he could not immediately identify what. It was not cruelty, exactly. It was more a kind of indifference, a sense that Guillaume's attention was elsewhere, that the woman beside him was an object to be acknowledged, rather than a person to be engaged with. The meal proceeded through multiple courses, bread and wine, then fish from the river, then roasted fowl, then meat in elaborate sauces, then subtleties made of sugar and spice that were more art than food. Conversation moved in waves across the hall, laughter rising and falling in response to toasts and jokes. Ashford orchestrated it all with subtle gestures and carefully timed interventions, steering conversation away from potentially contentious topics, ensuring that the evening maintained its veneer of civility and celebration. When the main courses had been cleared and the tables rearranged to create a space for entertainment, Thomas was summoned to perform. He had prepared carefully a mixture of courtly love songs appropriate to the occasion, instrumental pieces that demonstrated technical skill without demanding attention, and a few carefully selected stories that made light of romantic entanglement without suggesting that marriage itself was anything but desirable. He performed for perhaps an hour, and the response was warm. Nobles and merchants applauded, called for encores, and at one point Ashford himself nodded in appreciation. But Thomas's attention was divided. Part of his skill lay in performing while simultaneously observing, in maintaining the appearance of complete engagement with his music while his mind catalogued details of the room and the people in it. As he played, he watched the Lady Marguerite. She listened to his music with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to its quality, as though she were searching in the songs for something specific, some message or meaning that might provide guidance. At one point, their eyes met across the room, and Thomas saw something in her expression that resembled desperation. When the formal entertainment concluded, the evening continued more informally. Guests moved about the hall, conversing in small groups, the servants circulating with wine and delicacies. It was during this period that Marguerite approached him. She did so carefully, in the company of an older noblewoman, a companion or chaperone, but her intent was clearly to speak with him. "Your music is very beautiful," she said. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "You play with a kind of understanding that is rare." "You honor me, lady," Thomas replied, bowing slightly. "I attempt to serve the occasion." "The songs you sang, the ones about lovers separated by circumstance, seemed to understand something about that separation. How is it that you understand such things? You are a performer, a man of the road. Yet you sing as though you know what it feels like to want something that cannot be had." Thomas was struck by the question. It was the kind of personal inquiry that rarely came from nobility, and it carried an undertone of something he struggled to identify. He chose his response carefully. "All people, lady, regardless of their station, know something of desire and limitation. My art is to find the universal in the particular, to suggest that what seems personal is in fact shared. Whether I myself have experienced romantic separation is less important than whether my songs permit listeners to understand their own experiences more clearly." Marguerite listened to this with an expression of sadness. "You are wise," she said finally. "But wisdom does not make things bearable, does it?" Before he could respond, her companion gently took her arm and led her away. Thomas watched her go, troubled by the interaction in a way he could not fully articulate. She was a young woman of noble birth, betrothed to a powerful man, destined for a marriage that would bind families and territories. There was nothing unusual in this, nothing that should inspire sympathy or concern. Yet something in her manner suggested a gravity that exceeded the normal anxieties of a young bride. After the guests had retired, as servants cleared the hall and extinguished candles, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. He lay in the small chamber he had been given, near the kitchen, as Ashford had specified, and thought about Marguerite's questions and her sadness. He told himself that he was being foolish, reading significance into what were likely merely the ordinary melancholy of a girl facing an uncertain future. Yet the unease persisted. The next day passed in a kind of suspension. The formal ceremonies of the betrothal had been completed the previous evening. The current day was devoted to hunting and entertainment, activities that would culminate in another feast that evening. Thomas was not required to perform until evening, so he occupied himself by moving through the manor's grounds, observing its structure and inhabitants. It was during one of these walks that he encountered a figure he would later come to recognize as significant. A man in clerical garb, wearing the robes of a Benedictine monk. The man introduced himself as Brother Anselm, newly arrived from a monastery in the region, to minister to the sick and wounded who had been brought to Ashford's household after a minor skirmish with bandits on nearby roads. The encounter was brief and unremarkable. Brother Anselm seemed distracted and troubled, moving with a kind of purposefulness that suggested he had specific tasks to accomplish. Thomas noted this, filed it away with the other details of the manner that seemed potentially significant, and thought nothing more of it. The second feast was smaller and more intimate than the first, attended only by the closest associates and family members of both the betrothed couple and Ashford himself. Thomas performed again with similar success, though he was aware throughout his performance that Marguerite was not present. He asked one of the servants, carefully, why the lady was absent from the feast. The servant, a woman of perhaps 40, shook her head and said only that she was resting, that betrothal gatherings were exhausting for young women, that she would likely appear the following morning when the guests began to depart. But she did not. Thomas discovered this on the morning after the second feast, when he was preparing to depart, and found the manor in a state of controlled disturbance. Servants moved with unusual haste. Voices were lowered, but their tone conveyed alarm. It was Ashford himself who informed him of the situation, summoning him to his private chamber with a calmness that seemed almost deliberately cultivated. "The Lady Marguerite died last night," Ashford said without preamble. "She fell from the gallery overlooking the garden courtyard. The fall was fatal. The Lord Guillaume and his family have been informed. The betrothal, as you understand, is now dissolved. I am releasing all the performers and musicians I had engaged for the remainder of the gathering. You will be paid in full for your services, plus a bonus for your discretion. You will not speak of this matter to anyone. Is this clear?" Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a kind of internal displacement. "Yes, Lord. I am deeply sorry for your loss." "Your sorrow is noted," Ashford replied. "Now go. The roads are clear, and Troyes is not far. My steward will provide you with your payment." The payment was generous, far more than Thomas would have expected for 2 nights' work. It came in the form of silver coins, placed in a small leather purse by Ashford's steward, a man named Renaud, who delivered it without comment or explanation. Thomas accepted it, thanked Ashford formally, and departed the manor in the early afternoon. As he rode back toward Troyes, the roads that had seemed innocuous only days before felt suddenly sinister. The trees lining the path seemed to lean inward. The sky, which had been clear during his arrival, had turned gray with the threat of rain. He thought about Marguerite's sadness, her questions about desire and limitation, her absence from the feast, her sudden death. Officially, it was an accident. A young woman sleepwalking or seeking air had misjudged the gallery's edge in darkness and fallen. Such things happened. Young women were known to wander in their sleep, particularly when troubled by anxiety or melancholy. Yet something in the circumstances seemed wrong. the torn piece of fabric he had noticed near the fountain rather than near the courtyard where she was found. The presence of Brother Anselm, newly arrived and supposedly concerned with the sick and wounded. The way Ashford's calmness seemed not merely controlled but almost rehearsed, as though he had been anticipating this outcome and had prepared his response in advance. Thomas did not allow himself to linger on these thoughts. The monastery had taught him caution, and the road had taught him that asking questions about matters concerning the powerful was a dangerous pursuit. Ashford had paid him well and explicitly asked for his silence. The path forward was clear. Accept the payment, maintain the silence, and continue with his life as though the gathering at Ashford's Manor had been nothing more than one engagement among many. Yet as he rode back toward Troyes, Thomas understood that something had fundamentally altered. He had witnessed, or at least brushed against, something that existed beneath the surface of noble society, something darker and more complex than the straightforward exercise of power that he had previously understood. A young woman was dead, and the official story of her death seemed insufficient to contain the full truth of what had occurred. He could not prove anything. He possessed no evidence beyond fragments and suspicions, but he knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that Marguerite's death was not an accident. The question of what he should do with this knowledge would pursue him across the remaining years of his life, becoming the invisible structure around which everything else would eventually organize itself. 2 years passed. Thomas continued his circuit through the regions of northern France, performing at noble households and markets, accumulating coin and reputation in roughly equal measure. To outward appearance, nothing had changed from his life before Ashford's Manor. He maintained his careful professionalism, his distance from those who employed him, his refusal to become entangled in the affairs of any particular household. He was sought after precisely because he was reliable, skilled, and most importantly, discreet. Patrons trusted him not to gossip about what he observed in their homes, not to trade in the secrets and scandals that circulated through noble society like currency. Yet beneath this surface continuity, something had shifted irrevocably. Marguerite's death had opened a kind of wound in his understanding of the world. It had revealed, in a way that previous experience had not, that the systems of power that govern society were capable of orchestrating not just the small humiliations and injustices that he had previously witnessed, but something far more fundamental: the erasure of a person, the elimination of inconvenient life. He did not speak of these thoughts to anyone. The monastery had taught him the virtue of silence, and the road had taught him its necessity. But in the evenings, when he sat alone in whatever lodging he had secured, a room in an inn, a corner of a monastery guest house, occasionally a small chamber in a noble's household, his mind returned again and again to Ashford's Manor. He replayed the feast, Marguerite's desperate questions, the presence of Brother Anselm, the careful calmness of Ashford's announcement of her death. He tried to construct explanations, to understand how an accident could be so perfectly convenient, so precisely timed. It was in the spring of the second year following the feast that Thomas encountered his first concrete piece of information that extended beyond speculation and suspicion. He was performing at a market fair in Amiens, playing for merchants and common folk, when he struck up a conversation with an old woman selling herbs and remedies. She was, she claimed, from the region near Ashford's Manor, and when Thomas mentioned his previous engagement there, her expression became suddenly intent. "You were at the Lord's household?" she asked. "When was this?" "2 winters past," Thomas replied carefully. "I performed at a betrothal feast." The old woman leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Then you were there when the ward died, the girl who fell from the gallery?" "I was," Thomas said. He did not elaborate, but he watched the old woman's face carefully. "That was no accident," she said flatly. "Everyone in the villages around knows it. The girl was with child, and not by her betrothed." There was a young clerk in the household, nothing important, just a clerk, and he had gotten her with child. The Lord could not permit such a scandal. Bad for his position, bad for the marriage alliance. So he arranged for it to be finished. Thomas's heart accelerated, but he kept his expression neutral. "You seem very certain of this." "I'm certain because my grandson was one of the servants in the household. He was there that night. He said the girl was given something in her wine, something to make her sleep. And then she was taken to the gallery and—" The old woman made a gesture suggesting a fall. "The Lord wanted it to look like an accident. Sleepwalking, they said, or seeking air. But my grandson knew the truth." "What happened to your grandson?" Thomas asked. The old woman's expression hardened. "He left the region. The Lord's steward, a man named Renaud, he made it clear that anyone who spoke of what really happened would find themselves in difficulties. My grandson decided that the money was not worth the danger. He went to work for a merchant in the north. He does not speak of it now." Thomas thanked the old woman, purchased some of her herbs despite not needing them, and moved on through the fair with his mind in turmoil. This was the first confirmation he had received, however second-hand and impossible to verify, that his suspicions about Marguerite's death might have foundation in actual fact rather than mere speculation. Yet it was also precisely the kind of information that was dangerous to possess, an accusation based on the hearsay testimony of an old woman about what her grandson had supposedly witnessed would be laughable to the powerful. But if he were to pursue this information too openly, if he were to ask questions in the wrong places, he could become a problem that needed solving, just as Marguerite and the young clerk had become problems. From that point forward, Thomas's investigation, for it could be called nothing less, though he never framed it in those terms, became a kind of background presence in his life. He did not actively seek information with the intensity that might draw attention. Instead, he listened more carefully to conversations in halls and inns, asked subtle questions about matters that seemed tangential to the core mystery, and filed away details that might someday create a coherent picture. He learned that the young clerk who had fathered Marguerite's child was named Michel, and that he had been in service to Ashford for perhaps 3 years before the feast. He learned that Michel had subsequently died in what was officially reported as an accident, a fall from a horse while traveling on the Lord's business, merely weeks after Marguerite's death. He learned that Brother Anselm, the Benedictine monk he had encountered at Ashford's Manor, had once held a different position before becoming a wandering minister, and that his circumstances had changed notably after the events of that winter. He encountered Renaud again in Lyon, some 18 months after his investigation had truly begun. His former traveling companion was now established as a regular performer for a wealthy merchant family, and he seemed to have thrived in ways that suggested either greater skill or greater willingness to engage in the kind of compromises that Thomas had avoided. Renaud greeted him with genuine warmth and insisted they spend the evening together, sharing wine and stories as they had in the early years of their travels. But when Thomas, emboldened by wine and the familiarity of old friendship, began asking subtle questions about Ashford and what Renaud might know of events at his manor, his companion's demeanor changed instantly. His expression became closed, his manner cautious, and he placed a hand on Thomas's arm in a gesture that was almost threatening. "Do not ask me these things," Renaud said quietly. "Do not ask anyone these things. There are matters that are not meant to be understood by people like us, Thomas. People who speak about such matters find themselves inconvenienced. Travel ends. Opportunities cease. Or worse." "You know something," Thomas said. "I know that the world is ordered in ways that serve those with power, and that questioning that order is a luxury we cannot afford." Renaud released his arm and moved away. "Perform well, live quietly, accept the coin you are offered, and do not trouble yourself with mysteries that are not your concern. This is how one survives." The conversation haunted Thomas for weeks afterward. It suggested that Renaud, through whatever networks the performer had developed, was aware of the reality behind Marguerite's death. It also suggested that Renaud had made a choice, conscious and deliberate, to accept this knowledge and move forward without pursuing it. Thomas understood the logic of this choice. It was the safe choice, the choice that prioritized survival and continued prosperity over abstract notions of justice or truth. Yet he found himself unable to make the same choice, though he could not articulate exactly why. It was around this time that Thomas began to notice changes in his own performances. The humor that had once come easily now felt forced. The songs that had previously delighted audiences seemed hollow, inadequate to contain the weight of what he now understood about the world. He was aware that his patrons noticed this shift. Some interpreted it as artistic maturation, a deepening of sensitivity that made his performances more moving. Others seemed to sense something more troubling, a kind of disillusionment that threatened the pleasant escape his entertainment was meant to provide. One patron in particular, a noble woman named Isabelle, who engaged him regularly to perform at her household in the Loire Valley, took him aside after a performance in the 3rd year following Ashford's feast and addressed him directly. "You are troubled," she said simply. It was not a question. "I am well enough, lady," Thomas replied, offering the polite deflection that courtesy required. "No," she said, "you are troubled. Your music suggests a man carrying something heavy. I am not going to demand that you unburden yourself to me. That would be cruel and improper. But I will tell you this. I have learned, through the years of my life, that there are truths the world does not wish to acknowledge. There are injustices that go unremedied. There are deaths that should not have occurred. And there are people like yourself, people with conscience, who carry the knowledge of these things as a kind of curse. Such people are valuable precisely because they maintain their awareness of what should not be forgotten. But you must be careful, Thomas. The world will destroy you if you are not careful." Thomas did not confirm or deny that he was carrying such knowledge, but he was grateful for the acknowledgement, for the suggestion that his disquiet had a legitimate source and was not merely the self-indulgent melancholy of a performer. It was also during this period that Thomas refined his understanding of the networks of power that had facilitated Marguerite's death. He came to understand that Renaud, Ashford's steward, was more than merely a household administrator. He appeared to be connected to a broader network of people, clergy, merchants, minor nobility, who served one another's interests and who understood that maintaining silence about certain matters was itself a form of loyalty that would be rewarded. Through careful inquiry, Thomas learned that Renaud had subsequently left Ashford's service and taken a position in the household of a powerful bishop in Paris, a position that seemed disproportionately elevated for a man of his background, unless other considerations, such as demonstrated ability to manage delicate situations discreetly, had influenced the appointment. By the 4th year following the feast, Thomas had pieced together a version of events that seemed internally coherent, though he possessed no evidence that would hold up to scrutiny. Marguerite had become pregnant by a young clerk of low birth. The pregnancy threatened to complicate Ashford's political alliance with Guillaume's family. Someone, probably Renaud, acting on Ashford's implicit or explicit instruction, had arranged for Marguerite to be given a draught that induced sleep. She had then been placed on the gallery and made to fall, a death arranged to look accidental. The young clerk had subsequently been eliminated as well, his own death staged as accident. Brother Anselm, who had been present at the manor and possessed knowledge of what had occurred, had been rewarded for his silence with ecclesiastical preferment. Renaud had received promotion and greater responsibilities. Justice, in any conventional sense, was not merely absent from this situation, it was fundamentally irrelevant. The people responsible for orchestrating Marguerite's death occupied positions of power and were embedded in networks that protected them. There was no legal mechanism through which Thomas could bring his suspicions, no evidence he could present, no justice system that would hold such people accountable. The world, Thomas understood now with a clarity that was almost painful, did not operate according to the principles of fairness and justice that the monastery had suggested it might. It operated according to the logic of power and self-interest, and those who possessed power were capable of arranging the world to suit their needs, including arranging the deaths of inconvenient people, and leaving no trace but official stories and the private knowledge of those who had chosen survival over principle. This understanding should have brought him to despair. Perhaps it did, in ways he did not fully recognize. But it also brought something else, a kind of purpose, however nebulous and impotent. He could not bring Marguerite back. He could not punish those responsible for her death. He could not force the world to acknowledge what had happened. But he could remember. He could bear witness. He could maintain in his own mind and heart the truth of her existence and the reality of what had been done to her. This seemed like a small thing, almost insignificant, against the machinery of power that had crushed her. Yet it was the only thing available to him, and so he held on to it. His investigation did not end there, but it entered a new phase, less active, more reflective. He continued to listen and to gather information, but with a growing recognition of its ultimate futility. He encountered other performers and servants who had witnessed or knew of similar situations, smaller injustices and larger cruelties that characterized the world he inhabited. None of them possessed remedies. None of them knew how to press for accountability. All of them, in their different ways, had come to the same conclusion that Thomas was slowly arriving at. The world was fundamentally unjust, and one survived by accepting this and finding smaller ways to maintain one's conscience and humanity within a system that often seemed organized to destroy both. The church in Troyes was neither grand nor particularly notable. A modest stone structure with a single bell tower, attached to a small monastery that served primarily as a way station for traveling clergy and a refuge for the elderly and infirm. Thomas had passed through Troyes countless times over the years, had performed in its markets and noble households, had taken shelter in its inns during winter months. He knew its streets and rhythms as well as any man could know a place without making it his permanent home. It was during a winter visit, in the 5th year following Ashford's feast, that he encountered Brother Anselm again. The meeting was not planned. Thomas had ducked into the church to escape a sudden downpour, seeking shelter among its stone columns and vaulted shadows. He was alone in the nave, watching the rain blur the stained glass and listening to the water run from gutters, when he noticed an elderly man kneeling before the altar. The man's robes were those of a Benedictine, and something in his posture, the particular curve of his shoulders, the way his head was bowed, struck a chord of recognition in Thomas's memory. When the man rose and turned to leave, Thomas saw his face clearly and knew with certainty that it was Brother Anselm, though age had marked him more heavily than the intervening years alone seemed to account for. The cleric appeared diminished, as though he had been slowly compressed by the weight of something he carried. Thomas did not intend to approach him. Caution, which had been his constant companion for 5 years, suggested that such a meeting was precisely the kind of dangerous intersection that should be avoided. Yet some impulse he could not quite name, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, a recognition that this might be his only opportunity, caused him to step forward as Brother Anselm moved toward the door. "Brother Anselm?" he said quietly. The cleric stopped and turned. For a moment, there was no recognition in his expression, only the wariness of an old man confronted by a stranger. Then, gradually, something shifted in his face, not quite recognition, but perhaps the beginning of it. "I am sorry," Anselm said. "I do not recall Thomas. I was a performer at Lord Ashford's manor, some 5 years past when you were there ministering to the sick." The color seemed to drain from Anselm's face. His hand, which had been reaching for the church door, fell to his side. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "You should not speak of that place," he said. "Not here, not anywhere. There is nothing good that can come from such conversation." "I know," Thomas replied, "but I have questions that have tormented me for 5 years. I am not asking you to confirm anything that would place you in danger, but I am asking you to listen." Anselm looked around the empty church as though checking for hidden observers. Then, with movements that suggested great weariness, he sat on one of the wooden benches and gestured for Thomas to sit beside him. "Say what you will," Anselm said, "but understand that I may not answer, and that if you reveal this conversation to anyone, I will deny it entirely." Thomas spoke carefully, constructing his statements as questions rather than accusations, presenting what he had learned and understood as speculation rather than certainty. He asked about Marguerite, whether she had been troubled in those final days, whether she had sought counsel from the clergy. He asked about Michel, the young clerk, whether he had been a troubled man, whether his death had been as accidental as it appeared. He asked about Renaud, and about the mechanisms through which inconvenient situations were resolved in noble households. Anselm listened without interrupting, his face a study in internal conflict. When Thomas finished speaking, the old cleric was silent for a long time, his hands clasped tightly together, as though holding something precious or dangerous. "You are a good man," Anselm said finally, "which is precisely why I should not speak to you. But I am old, Thomas. I am dying. The physicians say I have perhaps a year, perhaps less. And I am tired of carrying this alone." What followed was not quite a confession, and certainly not a formal revelation of secrets. Instead, Anselm spoke in fragments and implications, creating a narrative that filled in the gaps in Thomas's understanding without ever quite stating anything with absolute certainty. He spoke of a young girl who had come to him seeking counsel, a girl who was terrified and desperate and convinced that her situation was hopeless. He spoke of his advice, well-intentioned advice, he insisted, though his voice suggested deep doubt about this, that she accept her fate, that she marry the man to whom she had been betrothed, and allow the child that she carried to be attributed to him after a suitable period. He spoke of her refusal, of her despair, of her assertion that she would rather die than live the life that had been mapped out for her. "I left," Anselm said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I told her there was nothing more I could do. I returned to my duties, and 2 days later, she was dead." "You knew how she had died?" Thomas asked quietly. "I knew," Anselm replied, "not with certainty, but I knew. I had heard things, servants whispering, unguarded comments, and I knew Lord Ashford well enough to understand that he would not permit a scandal. The girl was beautiful and valuable, only insofar as she served his purposes. When she became a liability instead, when her desires conflicted with his interests, she ceased to be valuable. She became a problem to be solved. And you did nothing." "I prayed," Anselm said, and there was bitterness in his voice. "I prayed for her soul. I attended her funeral mass and sang requiems for her. I maintained my silence, and I accepted. I was given, rather, a position of greater prestige and responsibility in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. I told myself that speaking would accomplish nothing, that it would only destroy me without helping her. I told myself many things, Thomas, and all of them were lies born of cowardice." The rain continued outside, a steady percussion against the stone walls. A shaft of weak winter sunlight penetrated the high window, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny souls through the cathedral space. "The young man," Anselm continued, "the clerk who had fathered the child, his name was Michel Varlet. He was a good man, quiet, hard-working, devoted to the girl. When he realized that she was dead and why she was dead, he attempted to speak about it. He tried to go to the bishop to seek justice. Renaud found out. Within weeks, Michel was dead as well. Another accident, another convenient removal of an inconvenient witness. Was it truly an accident? Thomas asked. No, Anselm said simply. It was murder, as surely as Marguerite's death was murder, though it was styled as accident. But there was no difference, Thomas. Murder styled as accident is still murder. Justice styled as mercy is still injustice. Thomas felt something collapse within him, some last fragile hope that the situation might be more ambiguous than he had feared. The death had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated, calculated, deliberate. And Anselm, who was a man of God, who had been trained in principles of morality and justice, had chosen silence over action. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked. "Why break silence now?" "Because I am dying," Anselm said again, "and I cannot carry it alone any longer. Because you asked, which suggests that the injustice was not forgotten, that someone has been bearing witness, even if that witness has no power. And because I need to know, before I die, that someone besides myself knows the truth, someone who is alive and might carry it forward, even if only in memory." "What good is memory?" Thomas asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "What good is bearing witness if nothing can be done, if no justice can be achieved?" "I do not know," Anselm replied. "I suspect the answer is that memory is all we have, that bearing witness to injustice is a form of resistance, even if it is a weak and ultimately futile resistance. And that perhaps, if enough people bear witness, if enough voices testify to the truth of what happened, then something like justice might eventually emerge from the accumulated weight of that testimony, even if it takes generations." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer. "But I understand your despair, Thomas. I share it. I have lived with it for 5 years, and I will carry it to my grave. I failed that girl when she was alive. I failed her by not speaking when she was dead. And I will die having failed her completely." Thomas sat with this for a long moment. He thought about Marguerite, a person he had briefly encountered but never truly known. He thought about Michel Varlet, who had loved her and had died for his attempt to seek justice. He thought about Renaud and Ashford and the bishop and all the other people embedded in networks of power and complicity. He thought about the machinery of injustice that seemed to operate beneath the surface of normal life, arranging deaths and erasures with a terrible efficiency. "What became of Michel's family?" Thomas asked finally. "He had a sister," Anselm said. "She lived in the region. After his death, she left. I've never learned what became of her. Perhaps she knew the truth and fled for her own safety. Perhaps she knew nothing and simply grieved. I have never had the courage to find out." They sat in silence for a while longer. The rain began to ease, and weak sunlight started to penetrate the stained glass more clearly, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. "I must go," Anselm said finally. "I should not have spoken. If anyone learns that I have revealed these things, I will deny it, and I will likely face questions about my fitness for my position. You understand this?" "I understand," Thomas said. "But I am grateful," Anselm continued. "Not because what I have done is good, but because I have finally shared the burden, and that sharing, however wrong it may be, has brought me some small measure of relief." He rose to his feet slowly, as though his joints pained him. "I will pray for you, Thomas. I will pray that you find some way to bear this knowledge that does not destroy you as it has destroyed me." Thomas stood as well. "Will you pray for Marguerite?" "Every day for the rest of my life," Anselm said. "And perhaps, after I die, I will finally have something resembling forgiveness for my own cowardice." They left the church together, stepping out into a world that had been washed clean by rain. The streets of Troy glistened in the weak winter light. People moved about their business with the ordinary preoccupations of daily life. Merchants opening their stalls, servants carrying water, children playing in puddles. Everything was exactly as it had been before, unchanged by the revelation that had just occurred in the darkness of the church. The world seemed indifferent to the truth of what had happened 5 years ago, indifferent to the death of a young woman and the injustice that had arranged it. Anselm walked slowly toward the monastery, and Thomas watched him go. He did not follow. Something in their encounter suggested that this was the end of their connection, that they would not meet again, that Anselm had discharged his final obligation by speaking, and would now retreat into silence for whatever remained of his life. Thomas stood alone in the street, holding the weight of confirmed knowledge. He had suspected most of what Anselm had told him, but suspicion was not the same as testimony from someone who had been present, who had direct knowledge of events. Anselm's words had transformed Thomas's understanding from speculation into something approaching certainty. The question now was what to do with this certainty. He could not bring Marguerite back. He could not punish those responsible. He could not undo the networks of complicity that had facilitated her death. He could only bear witness, as Anselm had suggested, and carry the truth forward, even if that truth changed nothing in the world, and led nowhere but into a kind of permanent, aching understanding of how the world actually worked. He walked through Troy that evening, past the market stalls and the inns where he had stayed, past the noble houses where he had performed. He looked at the faces of the people he encountered and wondered how many of them were carrying similar knowledge, similar witnessing of injustices that could not be remedied. How many people move through the world bearing testimony to crimes that would never be punished, to deaths that would never be avenged, to suffering that would never be acknowledged by the systems and structures that claimed to govern society justly. That night, Thomas sat alone in his room at an inn and began to compose a song. It was not a happy song, nor even particularly beautiful by the standards of courtly music. Instead, it was a song that told the story of a girl who fell from a height, a song that layered questions and implications, that suggested, without quite stating, the truth of what had happened. He did not know if he would ever perform it. He did not know if performing it would change anything. But the act of composition itself felt like a necessary gesture, a way of ensuring that Marguerite's story would persist in some form, even if only in the private notebooks of a performer who understood the impossibility of speaking truth openly. Years later, when people would ask Thomas why his music had changed during this period, becoming more somber and more philosophical, he would not explain about Anselm's confession or the confirmation of Marguerite's murder. Instead, he would simply say that he had come to understand something essential about the nature of human suffering and injustice, and that this understanding had necessarily transformed his art. This was true as far as it went, though it was only a partial truth. The fuller truth, that he had been changed by bearing witness to a specific, confirmed injustice, he carried silently, as Anselm had carried it, as a kind of permanent weight that shaped everything that followed. Paris in winter was a city of contradictions, vast and intimate simultaneously, capable of rendering a man invisible while making him acutely aware of being observed. Thomas arrived in the great city in his 34th year, approximately 6 years after Ashford's feast, carrying with him the weight of Anselm's confession and a determination to understand the full architecture of the network that had orchestrated Marguerite's death. He told himself that understanding was merely academic, that he was driven by intellectual curiosity rather than any hope of achieving justice. But he recognized this for the self-deception it was. He was searching for something, though he could not quite name what. Perhaps validation that his suspicions were warranted. Perhaps the identity of others involved in the conspiracy. Perhaps simply a more complete picture of the machinery of injustice that had crushed a young woman and left no trace but official stories and the private knowledge of those who had participated or witnessed. Paris was unlike any city Thomas had previously inhabited. Troyes and Amiens were substantial towns, centers of trade and clerical authority, but Paris was something else entirely. A sprawling agglomeration of perhaps 200,000 souls, arranged in parishes and districts that seemed to operate according to their own logics and rhythms. The city was divided by the Seine, which wound through its center like a vein, and by the invisible but no less real divisions of wealth and power. Thomas took lodgings in a modest quarter near the Cathedral of Notre Dame, in a room above a wine merchant's shop, paying rent in coin that had been carefully accumulated through performances and wise management. The city itself felt dangerous in ways that were both obvious and subtle. There were the obvious dangers, the thieves and brigands who operated in certain quarters, the diseases that circulated through the crowded streets, the arbitrary violence of city guards who answered to no one but the provost. But there were also subtler dangers, the invisibility that came from being anonymous in a crowd of hundreds of thousands, the way a single person could disappear into Paris and never be found if someone with power wished them to disappear. The sense that the city was governed by hidden hierarchies and networks that were far more complex than the administrative structures that nominally held authority. It was in this environment of productive paranoia that Thomas began his search for Renaud. What he knew was limited. Renaud had been Ashford's steward, had facilitated Marguerite's death, and had subsequently taken a position in the household of a powerful bishop in Paris. But Paris contained many bishops and many households. The bishop in question might be the Archbishop of Paris himself, or one of the numerous other ecclesiastical authorities who maintained significant establishments. Thomas began by asking careful questions in contexts where such questions seemed natural, performing at gatherings where clergy were present, striking up conversations with other performers who had worked in ecclesiastical households, gradually expanding the web of inquiry. It took him 3 months to identify that the bishop in question was likely Guillaume de Brain, a man of perhaps 60 years, of Burgundian origin, with significant influence in both ecclesiastical and secular political structures. Guillaume de Brain maintained a substantial household not far from the cathedral, and he was known to be a patron of musicians and performers. Thomas, through a combination of inquiry and luck, managed to secure an introduction to Guillaume's household administrator, and proposed himself as a performer for upcoming gatherings. The administrator, a man named Pierre, was cautious but not unwelcoming. He agreed to allow Thomas to perform at a gathering of minor clergy and minor nobility that would occur in the following week. The pay was modest, but the opportunity was invaluable. It would give him access to the household, a chance to move through its spaces and perhaps glimpse Renaud or learn more about the bishop's connections. The performance itself took place in a modest hall within the bishop's residence. The audience consisted perhaps 20 people, lower-ranking clergy, merchants with ecclesiastical connections, minor nobles who maintained relationships with the bishop. Thomas performed competently, offering music and stories that were appropriate to the occasion without being particularly memorable. What mattered was not the quality of his performance, but the information he could gather while performing. It was during the performance that he first saw Renaud. The man was serving wine and managing the logistics of the gathering, moving through the hall with the efficiency and invisibility of someone long accustomed to such work. He appeared to have aged considerably in the 6 years since Ashford's feast. His hair had grayed substantially, and there was a tension around his eyes that suggested perpetual vigilance. Yet he was unmistakably the same man, and Thomas felt his heart accelerate with a mixture of recognition and fear. More significantly, Thomas noted the deference with which the bishop and other household members treated Renaud. The steward was not merely a servant in the conventional sense. He occupied a position of genuine authority and trust, consulted on matters beyond his nominal duties, permitted to speak in ways that servants were not normally permitted to speak. This suggested that whatever role Renaud had played in Marguerite's death, that role had been deemed valuable enough to merit significant reward. Thomas did not attempt to speak to Renaud during that gathering. Caution, which had served him well, dictated that any direct contact would be dangerous. Instead, he established himself in the bishop's household as a regular performer, engaging in work that was steady, if not particularly lucrative, and positioning himself to observe Renaud more carefully over time. What he gradually came to understand was that Renaud was not acting under anyone's direct orders. Instead, he was coordinating a network: servants and minor clergy, merchants and minor nobility, who understood that their interests were best served by maintaining certain silences and cooperating in certain arrangements. It was a network of mutual benefit and mutual threat, held together by the understanding that betraying others in the network would result in exposure and destruction. Through careful observation and patient inquiry, Thomas came to see the logic of it. Renaud facilitated the bishop's access to services and information that enhanced his power. In return, the bishop protected Renaud from any consequences of his previous actions. Other members of the network benefited from connections and favors that flowed through Renaud's coordination. It was a system that was simultaneously fragile and remarkably robust. Fragile because it depended on everyone maintaining silence and everyone continuing to view their participation as advantageous. Robust because the mechanisms of enforcement, exposure, disgrace, destruction, were so severe that no rational person would voluntarily invite such consequences by speaking. Approximately 8 months into his residence in Paris, Thomas encountered Brother Anselm again. He was not surprised to learn that the cleric had come to Paris and had taken a position in the bishop's household, a position that was somewhat elevated for an old monk, suggesting that the bishop was aware of and had compensated him for his participation in the arrangements surrounding Marguerite's death. Anselm appeared even more diminished than he had in Troyes, as though the burden he carried had become progressively heavier with each year. They met by chance in the bishop's chapel, in the early morning when few others were present. Anselm recognized Thomas immediately, and his face registered a complex mixture of emotions: recognition, alarm, and something that might have been relief. "You have come to Paris," Anselm said quietly. "I have," Thomas replied, "and I have found Renaud. I have seen the bishop's household and understood something of how it operates." "And what will you do with this knowledge?" Anselm asked. The question carried an undertone of something beyond mere curiosity. "I do not know," Thomas said honestly. "I came here thinking that understanding the full scope of the conspiracy might lead somewhere. But I am beginning to suspect that understanding it merely confirms what I already knew, that the machinery of injustice is far more extensive and coordinated than I had realized, that the people involved, Renaud, the bishop, yourself, and many others, form a network that is explicitly designed to prevent the kind of accountability that might lead to justice." "And you are correct," Anselm said. "This is precisely what such networks are designed to do. They exist to ensure that certain people can act without consequence, that certain deaths and certain silences are maintained, regardless of their moral character." They spoke for only a few minutes longer, but the conversation clarified something that Thomas had been struggling to articulate. His investigation, which had seemed to him like a form of resistance or witness-bearing, was actually futile in a more fundamental way than he had previously understood. He was not simply pursuing a truth that the powerful preferred to hide. He was pursuing a truth that the powerful had deliberately and systematically ensured would never lead to any consequence or remediation. The network existed precisely to guarantee that even if the truth were known, even if it were spoken aloud, even if it were acknowledged, there would be no mechanism through which it could be converted into justice. Anselm died 3 months later, peacefully in his sleep, according to the bishop's household, though Thomas suspected that the peace had been more elusive than such descriptions suggested. He attended the funeral mass and observed the bishop and Renaud mourning with expressions of appropriate sorrow. It seemed almost obscene, this public performance of grief for a man they had corrupted, of loss for a man they had destroyed through their complicity and injustice. Yet Thomas understood that this too was part of the machinery, the ability to perform sorrow and regret convincingly, to maintain the external forms of morality while knowing oneself to be complicit in immorality. It was around this time that Thomas began to consider leaving France. The idea had not come to him suddenly. Rather, it had emerged gradually over months of residence in Paris, months of watching the network function, months of recognizing the absolute futility of any attempt to disrupt or expose the systems that held such people in place. He had learned what he came to learn, that Marguerite's death had been arranged, that the network responsible for her death remained intact and functional, that justice in any meaningful sense was not merely absent but structurally impossible. This knowledge, which he had pursued at some cost to his own peace, had not liberated him or provided him with any useful means of action. Instead, it had merely confirmed his understanding that the world operated according to principles that had nothing to do with justice or morality. In the spring of his 35th year, Thomas received an invitation to perform at a gathering that would include not only minor clergy, but also several nobles, and most significantly, Lord Ashford himself, visiting Paris on business related to his political interests. The invitation was almost certainly not coincidental. Renaud, who knew that Thomas had been performing in the bishop's household, had almost certainly ensured that Thomas received the opportunity to encounter Ashford directly. This was, Thomas understood, a kind of test, a confirmation that Thomas remained appropriately cautious and complicit in his own silence, or a warning that there were limits to how far his investigation could proceed. On the evening of the gathering, Thomas performed for approximately 1 hour, offering music and stories that were both technically skilled and emotionally restrained. He avoided any content that might be interpreted as commentary on the matters he had been investigating. He performed as though he were merely a competent entertainer, nothing more or less. After the formal performance concluded, while guests mingled and servants circulated with wine and delicacies, Thomas was summoned to a private chamber by Lord Ashford. The chamber was small and contained little furniture, a desk, several chairs, a fireplace where a fire burned weakly. Ashford sat behind the desk, and Renaud stood to one side, his presence suggesting that this was a conversation that multiple parties had authorized him to participate in observing. "I understand you have been performing in Paris," Ashford said. His voice was pleasant, almost cordial. "That you have been residing in the bishop's household and moving through circles where you might have heard various stories and rumors." "I have performed what I have been engaged to perform, Lord," Thomas replied carefully. "I have heard what people speak of in halls and markets, as performers always do." "And have you found Paris enriching?" Ashford continued. "Has your time here confirmed suspicions you brought with you, or altered your understanding in any way?" Thomas recognized the question for what it was, a test of his loyalty to silence, a confirmation that he would maintain the conspiracy of muteness that held the network in place. "Paris has taught me that the world is complex," Thomas said finally. "That what appears from a distance to be clear injustice becomes, upon closer examination, a matter of perspectives and considerations that I, as a mere performer, am perhaps not equipped to fully understand." Ashford smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. "Precisely the correct answer. I am pleased to hear it. You have demonstrated wisdom, Thomas. You arrived in Paris with questions, and you have spent time searching for answers. But you have also come to understand something essential: that certain matters are best left unexamined, that the pursuit of absolute truth in such cases is ultimately more damaging than useful, and that a man of your station can serve his own interests far better through discretion and silence than through any attempt to disturb the arrangements that men of power have made." "I understand, Lord," Thomas said. "Of course you do. And so I make you an offer. You are, I have determined, a man of genuine talent and discretion. I have use for such a man. If you would accept a permanent position in my household, not as a servant, but as a personal entertainer and advisor on matters of culture and patronage, I would provide you with comfortable lodgings, substantial compensation, and security such as few wandering performers can claim. In exchange, I would expect your continued discretion and your loyalty. You would essentially cease to wander. You would become established, settled, guaranteed." This was the offer that Thomas had anticipated from the moment Ashford had summoned him. It was also, he recognized, a trap of considerable sophistication. By accepting it, Thomas would secure his material circumstances and ensure his safety. But he would also surrender the freedom that the wandering life, for all its difficulties, had provided him. He would become embedded in Ashford's household, bound by gratitude and self-interest, increasingly complicit in the systems and arrangements that Ashford maintained. "I am honored, Lord," Thomas said slowly, "but I must ask for time to consider. Such a significant change in the circumstances of my life requires careful thought." "Of course," Ashford said. "Take a month. Consider carefully. But understand that this offer is contingent on your absolute acceptance of the necessity of silence. If you continue to ask questions, to pursue investigations, to speak carelessly about matters that are best left in darkness, then the offer ceases to be valid. In fact, your activities would become problematic in other ways." The threat was implicit but absolute. Thomas understood precisely what Ashford was communicating. Accept the offer and the security it provided, or face the consequences that fell upon those who became problems requiring solving. He left Paris approximately 2 weeks later, before his month of consideration had elapsed. He sent word to Ashford through Renault that he had decided to honor his existing commitments and travel south, toward the regions of the Loire Valley and beyond, suggesting that he would return to consider the offer more seriously in the future, a lie that bought him time and distance without provoking immediate retaliation. As he rode out of Paris, traveling southwestward on roads that he had traveled before and would travel again, Thomas understood that something had fundamentally changed in his relationship to his investigation. He had pursued the truth of Marguerite's death with an assumption that truth mattered, that understanding and bearing witness were forms of resistance, or at least forms of conscience. But Paris had taught him that truth, in certain contexts, was precisely the opposite of resistance. Truth that could not be acted upon, that could not lead to justice or change, that only bound the bearer of truth more tightly to the systems of complicity that perpetuated injustice. Such truth was a kind of trap, a way that power maintained itself by allowing certain people to know certain things while rendering them powerless to act on that knowledge. The Loire Valley seemed to welcome him back like a prodigal returning to a place of relative safety. The noblewoman Isabel, who had offered him shelter and friendship years before, still maintained her household and still welcomed his performances. It was in her company that Thomas began to consider the offer Ashford had made, and what it might mean to accept it or refuse it. "You are running from something," Isabel observed one evening as they sat in her private chamber after a performance that had gone well. "I am always running," Thomas replied. "It is the nature of my profession." "No," she said. "You are running from something specific, something you have learned or understood, and you are carrying it as a burden." Thomas did not deny this. Instead, he asked, "If a man knows something true about the world, something dark and damaging, but cannot act on that knowledge, cannot change anything through knowing it, is it better to carry that knowledge or to attempt to forget it?" Isabel considered this carefully. "I think," she said finally, "that carrying knowledge one cannot act upon is indeed a burden. But I also think that some burdens are worth carrying, because the alternative, willful ignorance or active complicity, is a kind of death of the soul. A man who chooses not to know, who deliberately closes himself off from truth, becomes something less than fully human. But a man who knows and carries that knowledge honestly, even if he cannot act on it, at least retains his humanity and his dignity." It was not exactly comfort that this answer provided, but it was something like philosophical ground, a way of understanding his situation that did not reduce him to mere victimhood or futility. Thomas carried the knowledge he had accumulated. He could not undo Marguerite's death or punish those responsible, but he could maintain in his own understanding and heart the truth of what had happened. He could bear witness through memory and through the quiet incorporation of that truth into his art and his understanding of the world. The invitation came in spring, carried by a messenger bearing Ashford's seal. It was written in formal language, composed by a clerk, but its substance was unmistakable. Lord Ashford was hosting a gathering of regional nobility in the city of Amiens, and he would be honored if Thomas would consent to perform. The gathering would be of significant importance. Several counts and their representatives would be present, along with ecclesiastical authorities and wealthy merchants. The compensation offered was more than generous, and there was, in the careful phrasing of the invitation, a reminder that Thomas had not yet given his definitive response to the offer of permanent employment that Ashford had made in Paris. Thomas understood the invitation for what it was, an ultimatum disguised as an honor. Ashford was calling him to account, demanding that he demonstrate his loyalty through acceptance of this public engagement, that he prove himself worthy of continued freedom through explicit participation in whatever ceremony or transaction was about to occur. The messenger waited for a response, and Thomas, recognizing the futility of refusal, agreed to travel to Amiens. He arrived a week before the gathering was scheduled to begin, taking lodgings at an inn near the cathedral. The city had changed somewhat in the years since he had last performed there, though the fundamental character remained the same. A prosperous town organized around trade and ecclesiastical authority. A place where power moved in visible and invisible channels beneath the surface of ordinary commerce. Thomas moved through the streets with the caution that had become habitual, aware that his presence here was no longer accidental or the result of his own agency. He was being positioned, placed deliberately in this location and time for purposes that extended beyond entertainment. The gathering took place in the manor house of one of Amiens' most prominent nobles, a man named Philippe, who maintained close ties to both the bishop and various counts in the region. It was here, in a hall decorated elaborately for the occasion, that Thomas saw for the first time the full architecture of the network that had orchestrated Marguerite's death 7 years prior. Ashford was present, of course, greeting guests with practiced courtesy. Renaud was present as well, managing logistics and moving through the hall with the authority of someone who coordinated far more than merely the logistics of a gathering. The Bishop Guillaume de Brain was there, conversing with dignity about matters of faith and politics. Several other figures whom Thomas had observed in Paris were present: minor clergy, merchants of significance, nobles with connections to networks of power that extended across the region. They moved together with a coordination that was not quite visible, but distinctly palpable, suggesting communication and mutual understanding that transcended the surface courtesies and formal conversations. Thomas was accorded a place of honor in the entertainment. He would perform at the main feast and also provide private entertainment during the evening's more intimate gatherings. It was a position of prominence that made him simultaneously visible and, paradoxically, useful as a kind of living decoration that could be consulted for perspective, but whose deeper views and understandings could be safely disregarded. The main feast was elaborate and lengthy, proceeding through multiple courses and toasts and carefully orchestrated moments of pageantry. Thomas performed his role competently, offering music that enhanced the occasion, telling stories that made the assembled nobility laugh without provoking discomfort, demonstrating the kind of excellence that justified his continued engagement. But his attention was divided, his senses heightened to observe details and currents beneath the surface conviviality. It was during the meal that Thomas first understood the true purpose of the gathering. The conversation, which had ranged across various topics during the earlier courses, gradually focused with increasing precision on matters of politics and power in the region. There were subtle negotiations occurring, the repositioning of alliances, the discussion of advantageous marriages between noble families, the coordination of interests regarding taxation and trade routes. These were the kinds of conversations that occurred at any gathering of regional power. Surface-level negotiations about the ordinary business of power. But beneath these conversations, Thomas perceived something else. An agenda that was deliberately being coordinated. Ashford and Renaud and the bishop were working in concert, guiding the conversation in particular directions, ensuring that certain agreements were reached and certain understandings were established. The network was not merely defensive, not merely engaged in protecting the secrets of Marguerite's death and the other arrangements that sustained it. The network was actively engaged in consolidating and expanding its power, using the cooperation that was demanded by shared complicity to achieve broader objectives. It was a revelation that was both obvious and shocking in its implications. Thomas had understood the network as primarily defensive, existing to maintain silence and prevent exposure. But he now recognized that the network was actively predatory, that the cooperative arrangements among its members were not merely designed to prevent their mutual destruction, but also to expand their collective advantage at the expense of those outside the network. After the main feast concluded and guests had moved into smaller gathering spaces throughout the manor, Thomas was summoned to a private chamber by Ashford. The room was comfortable and appointed with taste, a smaller version of the chamber in Paris where the last negotiation had occurred. This time Renaud was not present. Instead, Ashford was accompanied by the bishop, Guillaume de Braine, whose presence suggested that this conversation was authorized not merely by Ashford, but by multiple figures of significant power. "You have observed much in the past 7 years," Ashford said without preamble. "You have traveled extensively, performed in households across northern France, and gathered information about matters that do not strictly concern you. This is, I suspect, because you carry the burden of knowledge regarding matters we discussed in Paris. Is this accurate?" Thomas considered his response carefully. Denial would be insulting to men who had clearly maintained surveillance sufficient to track his movements and activities. Acknowledgement would be dangerous. He chose a middle path. "I have performed my functions as a musician and entertainer, Lord. If in doing so I have observed things that suggested broader patterns, I have maintained silence regarding them, as you instructed." "Indeed," the bishop said, speaking for the first time. His voice was calm and conversational, which somehow made it more threatening than Ashford's earlier directness. "Renaud has informed us of your activities in Paris. He has noted your particular attention to certain household arrangements and certain individuals. He has also noted that, despite this attention, you have maintained the discretion and restraint that you were advised to maintain." This suggests to us that you are, at your core, a man who understands his position and the limitations of his capacity to effect change. I am, Lord, Thomas said. And yet you have continued to investigate, to ask questions, to move through networks that touch upon matters we prefer not to have examined, the bishop continued. This suggests that while you understand your limitations rationally, there remains some part of you that does not fully accept them, some part of you that still clings to the notion that truth matters, that bearing witness means something, that the injustices of the world might eventually be remedied through the persistence of those who refuse to forget. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. This conversation was moving toward a conclusion that he could sense, but not yet fully articulate. I offer you a choice, Ashford said, and his voice had become almost gentle. This choice is more generous than you perhaps deserve, given the persistent nature of your inquiries. But we are inclined toward generosity, because we recognize in you a quality that is rare and valuable. You are talented, discreet, and fundamentally intelligent. These are qualities that we prefer to preserve rather than eliminate, if it is possible to do so. The bishop gestured toward a chair positioned near the fireplace. Sit, Thomas. You will be more comfortable if you sit. Thomas sat. The chair was comfortable, almost luxuriously so, which somehow made the situation feel more ominous rather than less. Your choice is this, Ashford continued. First, you can accept the position I offered you in Paris. You will become a permanent member of my household, elevated above servant status, but clearly below the status of true nobility. You will be comfortable, secure, and guaranteed a life of stability, such as few wandering performers ever achieve. In return, you will commit yourself absolutely to silence. You will not speak of Marguerite or Michel, or any of the other matters that have concerned you. You will not continue your investigations. You will incorporate what you know into your inner understanding, and never permit it to emerge into the world of speech or action. This option will result in your material comfort and continued life. Thomas waited, understanding that there was more to come. Second, the bishop said quietly, you can refuse this offer and continue your current existence as a wandering performer. In this case, we will ensure that your wandering becomes increasingly constrained. Patrons will gradually cease to employ you. Your reputation, which you have carefully cultivated over many years, will become subject to certain questions and insinuations. You will find yourself progressively isolated, increasingly difficult to place, gradually reduced to poverty and irrelevance. Eventually, you will either accede to the first choice under conditions of desperation, or you will simply disappear into the underclasses, where you will spend your remaining years in a kind of slow dissolution. And there is a third option, Ashford added, though I need not elaborate upon it. You understand what happens to people who become genuine threats to arrangements that men of power have made. The silence in the chamber was profound. Thomas could hear the fire crackling in the fireplace, could hear his own breathing, could hear the muffled sounds of the gathering continuing in the halls beyond the chamber. How long do I have to decide? Thomas asked. Until tomorrow evening, Ashford said. You will perform again tomorrow night. After the performance, you will inform Renaud of your choice. If you choose the first option, you will remain in this manner and begin your service in my household immediately. If you choose otherwise, you will be free to depart, though I would advise caution regarding where you attempt to travel. Thomas rose from the chair, his legs trembling slightly. I understand, Lord. I am grateful for the clarity and the generosity of the choice offered. You should be, the bishop said. Few men receive such consideration. Most are simply eliminated when they become problematic. We are extending this courtesy because we recognize in you a man of genuine potential, a man who might be preserved and incorporated rather than destroyed. Whether you prove worthy of this consideration remains to be seen. Thomas left the chamber and returned to his lodgings in the inn. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat at the small window of his room, looking out at the dark city, and considered the choices presented to him with a clarity that was almost painful. The first choice, acceptance of Ashford's offer, would provide security and comfort. It would also require the death of something essential within him, the deliberate construction of internal walls between his knowledge and his speech, between what he understood to be true and what he was permitted to acknowledge. It would make him complicit in the perpetuation of the network, would bind him through gratitude and self-interest to the very people whose actions he had come to recognize as fundamentally unjust. The second choice, continued refusal, would result in progressive isolation and destruction. He would be marginalized, made unemployable, reduced to poverty and irrelevance. The network would not even need to harm him directly. They would simply ensure that the conditions of his life became progressively worse until survival itself required him to either capitulate or disappear. As he sat through the long night, Thomas came to understand that both choices were in their way forms of death. The first was death of the spirit, the self-destruction that came from deliberately choosing complicity. The second was death of the body, the slow dissolution that came from refusing that complicity. But there was, he gradually understood, a third way. Not the elimination option that Ashford had referred to, but something more subtle. He could make the choice to leave France entirely. The offer Ashford had made was contingent on Thomas remaining within the network's sphere of influence. If Thomas were to remove himself from that sphere, to travel to the Holy Land or beyond, to render himself inaccessible to the network's mechanisms of control, then he would be neither accepting their offer nor remaining as a target for their progressive destruction. This was a choice that would cost him everything he had built: his reputation, his network of patrons, his established position as a performer of significance in northern France. But it would preserve his freedom and his capacity to maintain his own integrity. It was, in its way, the most difficult choice, because it required the deliberate destruction of everything he had worked for over 2 decades. He made his decision as the sky began to lighten in the east. He would perform one final time for Ashford, would give a performance that was technically brilliant, but emotionally distant, would perform with the understanding that this was the end of his career as a northern French performer. And then he would inform Renaud that he was choosing neither of the first 2 options, but was instead departing France entirely, traveling south and east toward the Mediterranean and beyond. The performance that evening was extraordinary. Thomas played with a kind of transcendent detachment, offering music that was technically perfect, but untouched by genuine emotion. He sang songs about love and loss, about wandering and homecoming, about the fundamental mysteries of human existence. But he sang them as though from a great distance, as though they were histories that had happened to other people in other times. The assembled nobility listened with expressions of pleasure and even admiration, unaware that they were witnessing the final performance of a man who was, in that moment, consciously severing himself from the world they inhabited. When it was finished, Thomas was congratulated by multiple guests. Ashford approached him with something that resembled genuine warmth and said, "That was exceptional, Thomas. Your performance tonight has only confirmed my belief that you are worthy of preservation. I trust you have reached a decision regarding my offer?" "I have, Lord," Thomas said, "but I must ask for your permission to depart Amiens this evening, rather than remaining to serve in your household immediately. There are matters in other regions that require my attention, and I wish to complete them before committing myself fully to your service." This was a calculated lie, structured to provide Ashford with a reason to permit his departure that did not require Thomas to commit himself to the network's structures of control. Ashford studied him for a long moment. Then, "I will grant you 6 months. Travel where you must. Conclude whatever matters require concluding. But at the end of 6 months, I will expect you to present yourself at my manor and begin your service. If you do not arrive, I will understand that you have chosen unwisely, and the consequences of that choice will follow inevitably." "I understand, Lord," Thomas said. "I will return." He would not return. But Ashford did not need to know this immediately. Thomas departed Amiens the following morning, traveling slowly and deliberately, allowing time for any surveillance to understand that he was not fleeing in panic, but traveling with purpose. He moved southward, through territories he had traversed before, but with a new understanding of their significance. He performed occasionally to earn coin, but he was no longer building a reputation or seeking to establish himself in the patronage networks of any particular region. Instead, he was systematically dismantling his presence, ensuring that the network would gradually understand that Thomas had effectively removed himself from their sphere of influence. By winter of his 36th year, Thomas had traveled to the Mediterranean coast. By spring, he had secured passage on a merchant vessel traveling to the Holy Land. By summer, he was in ports and cities where his northern French reputation preceded him only faintly, where his music was appreciated without binding him to networks of obligation, where he could perform and move with a freedom that came from being sufficiently distant from the structures of power that had sought to contain him. He did not return to France at the end of the 6 months. He did not return after a year. Ashford, understanding that Thomas had chosen effective exile rather than complicity, did not pursue him. The network had learned what it needed to learn, that Thomas knew too much to be trusted, but that he could be rendered harmless through the simple mechanism of making his presence in French society impossible and his absence irrelevant. Thomas never again performed in the households of northern French nobility, but he carried with him, across the Mediterranean and beyond, the full knowledge of what had occurred and what the network continued to orchestrate. He carried Marguerite's story in his heart, and eventually, in songs that he would compose and perform in distant lands, where no one would recognize the references or understand the significance of what he was encoding in his music. He had lost much: his reputation, his established position, his home in the only Europe he had known. But he had preserved something that seemed to him, as the years passed and his understanding deepened, to be more valuable than all of those things combined. He had preserved his capacity to remember, to bear witness, and to refuse the easy complicity that power offered to those willing to accept it. The monastery in Provence occupied a fold of land where olive groves descended toward a small stream, and beyond them, the land opened into vistas of such clarity and light that they seemed almost unreal to those who had spent their lives in the northern fog and mist. The building itself was not large, perhaps a third the size of the monastery where Thomas had spent his childhood, but it was beautiful in a way that suggested not grandeur, but rather a kind of essential rightness, as though the structure had been placed precisely where it belonged and had been left undisturbed for centuries. Thomas had arrived at this monastery 15 years prior, in the summer of his 51st year, worn by decades of travel and carrying with him a collection of instruments, notebooks, and memories that constituted the archive of his life. He had not come seeking to take vows. The time for such commitments had long passed, and he had learned through years of wandering that his relationship to faith was too complicated and his need for freedom too profound to permit such binding arrangements. Instead, he had come seeking something else, a kind of harbor where the storms of perpetual motion might temporarily cease, where the accumulated knowledge and sorrow of his years might find some resting place. The prior who had admitted him, a man named Matthias, himself middle-aged and bearing the marks of a life lived in pursuit of understanding rather than rigid piety, had recognized in Thomas something that warranted welcome without requirement. They had spoken briefly about Thomas's history, his skills, his needs. The prior had asked no questions about the sorrow that was evident in his bearing, the weight that seemed to have accumulated in his shoulders and around his eyes. Instead, Matthias had offered Thomas a small chamber adjacent to the library, permission to move freely through the monastery's spaces, and an informal role as keeper of stories and instructor to the younger brothers who showed inclination toward music and learning. "We are not as rigorous as the great monasteries," Matthias had said during that initial conversation. "We are too small, and I suspect too pragmatic to maintain such strictures. You may live here as long as it suits you, subject only to the expectation that you will contribute your talents and knowledge to the community's life. In return, we will provide shelter, meals, and the freedom to pursue whatever understanding or peace you seek." This arrangement had suited Thomas perfectly. For 15 years he had inhabited a strange and delicate position between the monastic community and the broader world. He participated in the offices when it pleased him, sang in the chapel with a voice that had aged but retained its essential quality, and taught younger monks and visiting scholars about music and storytelling. But he was not bound by monastic discipline. He received visitors, travelers and merchants, and occasionally people from the region who sought his counsel or his performance. He maintained a correspondence with certain patrons and friends he had made during his years of wandering, though the letters grew progressively fewer as the years accumulated and his circle of those who remembered him gradually diminished. It was in this monastery that Thomas had completed the full composition of Marguerite's story, the song cycle that had occupied him for decades, that had grown and evolved across the years and miles of his wandering, that had gradually incorporated not just the events of her death, but also the broader understanding of how power functioned, and how injustice persisted, and how the mechanisms of silence and complicity operated to render truth impotent. The cycle was rarely performed in its complete form. It was too long, too complex, too emotionally demanding. But pieces of it had circulated, had been learned and sung by other musicians, had gradually entered the broader repertoire of traveling performers in ways that ensured Marguerite would not be entirely forgotten, even by those who did not know her name or the specific circumstances of her death. On a particular autumn afternoon, when the light had taken on the particular quality of late season, Thomas sat in the monastery's garden, a space smaller and less cultivated than the garden of his childhood, but not without its own kind of grace, and received a visitor. The visitor was a young performer, perhaps 25 years of age, traveling through the region and having heard of an old musician who maintained residence at the monastery and who was known to be possessed of unusual wisdom regarding the nature of stories and music. The young man's name was Lucian, and he had a quality of earnest hunger about him, the look of someone seeking knowledge that he sensed was important, but could not quite articulate. They sat together as the afternoon light began its descent toward evening, and after some preliminary conversation about the young performer's travels and his work, Lucian asked Thomas the question that many young performers eventually asked. How does one know when to speak of things that are dangerous, when to remain silent for one's own safety, and when to risk that safety by speaking truth? Thomas was quiet for a long time before responding. He had been asked variations of this question throughout his life, and he had never found a fully satisfactory answer. But the weight of nearly 70 years had given him, if not wisdom, then at least a kind of hard-won perspective on the matter. "There is a young woman," Thomas said finally, "whose story I have spent much of my life attempting to preserve. Her name was Marguerite, and she died more than 40 years ago in circumstances that were styled as accident, but were in fact carefully orchestrated by men of power who found her existence inconvenient. I have never been able to bring those men to justice. I have never been able to force the world to acknowledge what occurred, but I have carried her story with me. I have transformed it into music and song. I have shared it with those who seemed capable of understanding, and in doing so, I have ensured that she was not entirely erased, that her brief existence and the unjust manner of her death were witnessed and remembered by someone, even if that remembrance changed nothing in the immediate world. But you suffered for this," Lucian said. "You were forced to leave France, to abandon everything you had built." "I was," Thomas acknowledged. "And for many years I questioned whether that suffering was justified, whether the act of bearing witness meant anything in a world organized by power and indifference. But I have come to understand something over the long years. The act of remembering is itself a form of resistance. The act of refusing to allow injustice to be entirely forgotten, to be entirely absorbed into the silence that power prefers. This act matters, even if it does not immediately result in justice or change." He paused, and a slight smile appeared on his weathered face. "I will tell you something else that I have learned, Lucien. There are people in this world who, when they encounter truth, will recognize it and will be changed by encountering it. These people are rare, but they exist. If you speak your truth to the right people at the right moment, you may plant a seed that will grow in ways you cannot predict or control. The networks of power may silence you, may destroy you, may render your immediate efforts futile. But the truth, if it is a true truth, is difficult to entirely kill. It will persist in the memories and hearts of those who have heard it. It will echo into futures you will not see. Lucian listened intently, absorbing this with the kind of receptiveness that suggested genuine hunger for understanding, rather than mere politeness. "What became of the people who orchestrated her death?" the young performer asked. "Did any of them ever face consequences?" "Not in any formal sense," Thomas said. "The man who arranged it, a nobleman named Ashford, lived another 20 years and died in his bed, surrounded by family and the respect of his peers. The steward who facilitated it, a man named Renaud, prospered and eventually achieved a position of considerable influence. The bishop who was complicit in the arrangement continued his ecclesiastical career and earned the reputation of a pious and wise man. The network that bound them together continued to function long after Marguerite's death, orchestrating other arrangements, other silences, other carefully managed disappearances. He fell silent, and the weight of this reality seemed to settle over the garden like a kind of benediction. "And yet," Thomas continued, "I had the opportunity in recent years to learn of something that suggested the machinery of power was not quite as perfectly efficient as it appeared. The bishop's successor, a man less connected to the networks of complicity, eventually learned something of what had occurred. He did not bring anyone to justice. The people responsible were mostly dead by that time anyway, but he ensured that a particular monastery received an unusual endowment, and he ensured that certain records were preserved and carefully maintained. Someone, somewhere, knows the truth. Not everyone, not the world at large, but someone. And that someone is bound by conscience to maintain that truth and to ensure it is not lost." The sun descended further, and the light took on that particular quality of deep gold that precedes dusk. Thomas and Lucian sat together in silence for a while, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden and the temperature begin to drop with the coming of evening. "I think I understand," Lucian said finally, "or at least, I understand more than I did before. Thank you for trusting me with this." "You will face your own choices," Thomas said. "Moments when you will know truths that are dangerous to speak, when you will have to decide whether to accept the comfort of silence or risk the consequences of speech. I cannot tell you which choice to make. I can only tell you that the choice matters, that your conscience will hold you accountable regardless of what the world may say, and that there is a kind of dignity in choosing honestly, even when that choice brings suffering." Lucian departed the following morning, continuing his travels southward. Thomas never heard from him again, though many years later, long after Thomas himself had died, there would appear in circulation certain songs and stories that bore the unmistakable influence of conversations that might have occurred in a monastery garden in Provence. Stories that preserved details and perspectives on medieval injustice in ways that suggested they came from sources with genuine historical knowledge. But this is speculation, and Thomas himself would never know whether the seed he had planted in Lucian's understanding had borne fruit or had simply been scattered into the wind. The years following that encounter continued much as they had before, quiet, structured around the rhythms of monastic life, but not bound by them, filled with music and conversation, and the kind of deep reflection that comes from having lived long enough to recognize patterns and understand the texture of human existence across decades. Thomas continued to teach, continued to compose, continued to receive visitors. He watched younger monks grow and age, and occasionally depart for positions elsewhere. He saw the monastery gradually become known as a center of learning and artistic cultivation, a place where knowledge was preserved and transmitted, without the rigidity that characterized more austere communities. Prior Matthias died when Thomas was in his 68th year, and the new prior, a younger man named Guillaume, maintained the arrangement that had been established. If anything, Guillaume was even more permissive, recognizing in the elderly musician a kind of living connection to traditions and perspectives that were becoming increasingly rare. Thomas was freed from even the nominal expectations that had previously governed his time, permitted to live in something approaching complete freedom within the monastery's bounds. It was during these years of greatest freedom that Thomas began to reflect more consciously on his life and its meaning. He had lived longer than most people of his era, had experienced more of the world than most individuals, had accumulated knowledge and understanding that would ordinarily die with him. He had witnessed injustice and had been powerless to prevent it. He had accumulated truth and had been rendered unable to act decisively upon that truth. He had pursued justice and had come to understand that justice, in any meaningful sense, was not available to people of his station. And yet, looking back across the decades, Thomas came to recognize that this was not actually a story of futility. It was a story of transformation. He had arrived at the monastery in Provence as a broken man, stripped of his position and his prospects, unable to reconcile his understanding of injustice with his inability to remediate it. But across the years of quiet residence, he had gradually come to understand that the meaning of his life was not to be found in grand gestures or decisive action. It was to be found in the accumulation of small witnessing, in the preservation of memory, in the quiet act of refusing to accept the world as the powerful wished it to be understood. In his final years, and Thomas lived to be 75, which was extraordinary for the era, he undertook one final project. He compiled a complete record of the story of Marguerite, written in a careful hand, annotated with the knowledge he had accumulated over the decades. He drew maps of the places involved. He recorded the names of those who had been complicit, the dates of significant events, the locations of documentary evidence that might exist in various ecclesiastical and noble archives. He did not compose this record with any expectation that it would lead to justice or accountability, but he composed it with the understanding that truth, once recorded, becomes difficult to entirely erase. Future generations, if they cared to look, if they possessed the curiosity or the commitment to pursue obscure histories, would find evidence that what had occurred was not accident, but deliberate orchestration. When Thomas died, in the spring of his 76th year, the monastery gave him a funeral that was perhaps slightly more elaborate than was customary for those of his station. Prior Guillaume, recognizing that an era had ended, ensured that Thomas was buried in a place of honor within the monastery's small cemetery, beneath a stone carved with his name and the simple inscription, "Witness to Truth." The manuscript that Thomas had compiled, the full history of Marguerite's death, and the network that had orchestrated it, was carefully preserved in the monastery's library. It would remain there for centuries, consulted occasionally by scholars, largely forgotten by the broader world, but present and accessible to anyone with sufficient dedication to search for it. In this way, Thomas's final act was perhaps his most significant. He ensured that the truth, even if it could not be acted upon immediately, would persist. It would wait in silence for generations until circumstances might change, until people with power and will might emerge who could transform preserved testimony into something resembling justice. The world that Thomas had inhabited, the world of nobles and bishops, of networks of complicity and mechanisms of silence, of injustice rendered invisible through careful management, had gradually transformed across the centuries that followed. Power structures had shifted. Communities had evolved. New understandings of human rights and dignity had emerged. The specific injustices that had characterized Thomas's era were no longer possible in precisely the same form, though new injustices had emerged to take their place. But somewhere in that great transformation, the story that Thomas had preserved found its way into historical consciousness. Scholars eventually located his manuscript. Historians began to understand Marguerite not as merely a footnote in the life of a minor noble, but as a human being whose death revealed something essential about how medieval power functioned and how the mechanisms of injustice protected themselves. In this way, Thomas's bearing of witness, his refusal to accept silence, his persistent effort to preserve truth, even when that truth could not immediately be acted upon, eventually contributed to a larger understanding of human dignity and the necessity of accountability. The specific people responsible for her death were long dead and beyond the reach of any earthly justice. But the machinery of injustice that had destroyed her was gradually understood, and in some small measure, eventually resisted. On the day after Thomas was buried, as the monks of the monastery were preparing for the evening offices, one of the younger brothers, a man named Michel, coincidentally sharing a name with Marguerite's lost love, came to Prior Guillaume with a question. "What was the old musician's life about?" Michel asked. "He lived here peacefully enough, seemed content in his way, but there was always a kind of sorrow about it." "Did you ever understand what weighed on him so heavily?" Guillaume, who had become quite fond of the elderly Thomas and had heard fragments of his story, considered the question carefully. "I think," Guillaume said finally, "that he carried the knowledge of an injustice that he could not remedy. He lived in an era and circumstances that did not permit him to achieve justice, or even to speak openly of what he knew. But he refused to forget. He refused to allow silence to erase the truth, and in his way, I believe he believed that this refusal mattered, that bearing witness, even silently, even across decades of isolation, was itself a form of truth-telling that would eventually matter." The young brother nodded slowly, absorbing this. "That seems like a hard way to live." "It is," Guillaume agreed. "But I suspect it is also the only way to live with integrity when the world does not permit you any other choice." The bell tolled for evening prayers, and the monks began to move toward the chapel. The body of Thomas had been committed to the earth. His instruments had been carefully preserved. His manuscripts would eventually find their way to future generations. But what persisted most powerfully was not these material artifacts, but rather something more ephemeral. The understanding that a life devoted to witness and memory, however constrained and however unable to achieve immediate justice, was nevertheless a life of dignity and ultimate meaning. The autumn light faded into darkness as the community gathered to sing their evening offices. The words of the Requiem Mass floated out across the monastery grounds and into the Provençal night. In the peaceful darkness, the story of Thomas and Marguerite, and all the other stories of quiet witnessing and refused silence that constituted the texture of human life, persisted like seeds, waiting for the spring that might eventually nurture them into growth. The world was still unjust. Power still functioned through networks of complicity and mechanisms of silence. But somewhere in the great accumulation of human testimony and preserved memory, the possibility of future transformation remained. And this possibility, fragile and uncertain though it might be, was perhaps the greatest gift that one human being could offer to future generations. Not the promise of solved problems or achieved justice, but rather the insistence that truth matters, that witness matters, and that the refusal to forget, even when that refusal brings suffering, is itself a form of grace.